question we're going to be asking is, how can we design humane, resilient and joyful, livable cities? How can we deliver urban regeneration without encouraging excess gentrification? Now, I was a bit bemused by the first question because I wasn't quite sure what a livable city was, so I decided to find out. And there's various organisations who define exactly what a livable city is, from the Economist Intelligence Unit, Monocle magazine, the OECD. They define things like the quality of architecture and urban design, the quality of public transport, access to nature, safety, climate, healthcare, all the usual things that you think would make up a good city. And yet, every year, they manage to somehow come up with Melbourne, Vancouver, Toronto, Adelaide, Calgary, Sydney, Helsinki, Perth, Auckland, Zurich, Geneva. Never any sign of London, never any sign of Paris, never any sign of Hong Kong, New York, LA, all the kind of exciting places where you might actually want to live. So my first question would be, actually, do we want to live in the so-called livable cities? Officially, the OECD has voted Canberra the best city in the world 2 years in a row. A local newspaper said Canberra is a desolate wasteland of bleak suburbia punctuated by shiny, expensive monuments, fake lakes, porn megastores, snake-riddled grasslands, and endless befuddling roundabouts. Best city in the world, according to the OECD. The second question, I think, is also really interesting, considering it's 2014, talking about gentrification, because I'm sure, as many of you know, this year is the 50th anniversary of the word gentrification being coined by, believe it or not, by German Marxist sociologist Ruth Glass, who actually came up with the term in her study of the kind of Guardian reader haven of Islington in the 1960s, seeing, influx of middle-class residents displacing blue-collar workers, sanding floorboards, and, bringing in cappuccino, supping Guardian readers, essentially. So very apt that the Guardian is hosting this event. In 1964, she was very prescient in her analysis. She actually said, London may acquire a rare complaint. It may soon be faced with an embarras de richesse, an embarrassment of riches, in her central area, and this will prove to be a problem. But little did she know, I think, that exactly 50 years on, there'd be a report describing Islington as a borough of super gentrification. So we've exceeded her wildest nightmares, I think it's fair to say. So with me to tackle these two questions and hopefully provide some answers, I think we couldn't have a better qualified panel. Tonight we've got Richard Rogers and Jan Gehl and Jerome Frost, none of whom need an introduction, but I've been asked to introduce them, so I will. Obviously, Richard Rogers, founder of the Richard Rogers Partnership, now Rogers Stirk Harbour, has basically won every award going for architecture and urbanism, from the Pritzker Prize to the RIBA Gold Medal, and of course the Sterling Prize. In 1995, he was the first ever architect to deliver the Wreath Lectures, and I think it's fair to say more than any other architect in the country has been closely associated with politics. He could be credited with influencing government policy on urban development and regeneration for more than 20 years. Firstly being made a Labour peer in 1996, setting up the Urban Task Force in 1998, producing the white paper Towards an Urban Renaissance, which has basically defined the way we regenerate cities, for better or worse, over the last 20 years. So we'll be pressing him on some of those issues tonight. Jan Gehl has been called the ultimate guru of streets and public spaces. Again, it's fair to say more than anyone in the world, he is an expert on actually how people use streets and spaces and what makes a kind of vibrant, so-called livable city. Trained as an architect, he founded Gehl Architects, which defines itself, interestingly, as urban quality consultants. He's an author of numerous books that have become kind of staple bibles for urban planners, from Life Between Buildings, New City Spaces, Cities for People. He's credited with the transformation of Copenhagen into this kind of pedestrianised utopia for cyclists and pedestrians alike, and has even turned his hometown into an adjective, to Copenhagenise. So we'll be seeing what that actually means tonight. And then we'll be having Jerome Frost, who leads Arup's global planning business and Arup's consulting practice in the UK, Middle East and Africa, which includes 21 businesses focused on project planning, design, innovation and development. But before joining Arup, he was actually the man in charge of the Olympics.
Not quite.
His official title was the Head of Design and Regeneration for London's Olympic Delivery Authority from 2006 to 2011, for which he actually was awarded the OBE. He specialises in economic development, urban regeneration and master planning, and he's currently leading a whole list of projects from Croydon to Tottenham, advising on HS2, the Tokyo Olympic Games and the Dubai Expo 2020. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, who has 10 minutes. They're each going to have 10 minutes, then there'll be half an hour of me trying to grill them, and then it'll be open up to you guys for half an hour. So please be thinking of very pressing questions over the next hour or so, because you'll have plenty of time to ask them. So, Richard.
More people live in cities than anywhere else. England is probably the fourth densest country in the world, Bangladesh being the first, and Holland being the third. So we have to make them livable. I don't think there's any question about it. Cities are all for the meaning of people. They're for mix, for the poor and the rich. They're especially for advance of thinking, talking, and business. I put this, Masaccio, the first great Renaissance painter, showing the whole concept of mix. This is one of my favorite cities, Pienza, not far from Siena, and again, it's a perfect compact city. Now we'll mainly be talking about a compact city. A city which is cut off where it's absolutely urban with a wonderful piazza, partly designed, the center part has been redesigned, shall we say, the great piazza by Alberti, and Alberti is architect Rossellini, and is a very good example of that concept. On the left is sprawl, which shouldn't be anywhere, it happens to be south of France, but that shows what could happen if we didn't have regulations. On that other, on the left shows what could happen on the right. And one of the themes of this is you need people to talk to people to meet people in convivial spaces, areas. And urban task force was already mentioned. Left hand is sprawl, the center of the dark blue, there's better transport, and as it moves out and so it sprawls, everybody starts going by car, they lose contact with each other, there is no conviviality, and so we changed a compact city, the city of neighborhoods. The dark colors are higher density, you spread out. The centerpieces are bus or train, the larger ones are obviously train and underground. Then you work the buses and so on. Everybody should be able to walk to public transport. So it's basically walking with public transport. One of the battles I've been having for the last year, or in fact probably longer, is this whole question of new towns. I'm totally against new towns. Because we've got enough space inside our towns to build cities in towns. I use cities in the broadest sense. We were just discussing Croydon, so I won't take your thunder, but you can get a new city in the center of Croydon because there's so much space. And it's got good public transport, and it would make it much more convivial and secure. So on the left is a 19th century, if you call new city, if you like, Nottingham Gate. New town, Milton Keynes, and you can see why everybody has to walk and why it's the biggest car use in Britain. And Newtown, King's Cross area, there's also obviously the area around the Olympics, which is a very good example of a new town. Here you are able, in those towns, they're one's able to use the infrastructure that exists, whether it's corner shops, whether it's transportation, whether it's a higher density for the meeting of people. A couple of examples. Trafalgar Square, once called the heart of an empire. I used to call it the roundabout of an empire. Nobody could get to it. Left-hand side is as it was, with transport round, and what it is today. Don't think anybody now talks about converting it back to places for cars. It's a place where you meet people. Below is the Thames scheme, which we showed in 1968, the Royal Academy, saying that the south side of the Thames should be as civilized as And so the north side of the Thames should be as civilized as the south. The south is probably the best piece of urban regeneration, certainly I would say in England, where you can now walk the great length and where there are parties and there are a great mixture of different cultures, people, as well as different activities. I'm sure that I stole the left-hand one from Jan, without telling him probably, which is Copenhagen, and the mixture of people. I always use it. I don't often say it's Jan's photograph, but I'll tell him. And on the right is our local high street, Hammersmith. Admittedly, a little bit, both those photographs are rather old, but you can see why people aren't going to walk on the right-hand side, why people aren't going to meet, why people use cars as sort of armoured cars because they're frightened and scared, and it's not an atmosphere where you feel very friendly to your neighbour. Another example, cars. One of the most subtle and amazing changes that London's had for 40 years now is that in the City of London, you don't have cars under offices. We've just finished the cheese grater, Leadenhall. We are building a building in Mexico, both are just under 1 million square feet. One has 3,000 car parking spaces. That is Mexico, which already you can't move. And Leadenhall has about 15, if I remember rightly. And that is an amazing thought. Therefore, no one objects. We've got used to it, and it works. Yes, it's got good public transport. It's not as simple as all that. It's a lot of it, very intelligent engineering of spaces and movement. A place for all people. What's written on the left-hand side is the first statement when we won, Renzo and I, won the Pompidou, the Beaubourg competition. And in a way it reflects, I suppose, what we believe in, a place for all people, the young and the old, the poor and the rich. A place where people can enjoy. So the idea of the public piazza is not just a horizontal thing, but it's also a vertical. Yeah? And that you can use buildings as public spaces, escalators, lifts and so on, and views are much better. It's much more enjoyable to go up an escalator or a lift on the outside than be squashed into a lift with somebody's head in your stomach. So it continues the concept of movement, but also that buildings have a political motive, that buildings are frameworks for activities, that buildings change all the time, that when we started with Arup, they were our partners on the Pompidou. When we started, for instance, the library was, I don't know when that comes third, or whether it's 3 minutes. I'll be single. I forgot what I was going to say. But anyhow, basically what we're saying, it's frameworks for activities. Regeneration around areas is a good question, which is, of course, this area, which was one of the poorest areas in the centre of Paris, it was the brothel area, had been cleared in the 30s. The politicians thinking the way to get rid of prostitution was to remove the buildings. The prostitution were much more sophisticated and then move one street back. And this has been regenerated. Of course, that's the good part. The bad part is prices have gone up. Cheese grater, we already mentioned. I think the two most important things which are perhaps worth mentioning. One is the great piazza at the bottom. So it's open, it's not glazed, it's a people's space. Very difficult. Office buildings are the most difficult. Not even only because the form tends to be absolutely standardized, the core is a minimum core, space around the core to the glass is standardized, but because obviously the developer understandably wants the most money, and therefore he brings it straight down into the street. We had another advantage from a developer who was willing to give a space for public below, but also we have to thank St. Paul's because we have to move out of its viewing code, and therefore it moves backwards to open up the view, and that allows us a more interesting skyline, which is again part of the skyline is part of the public domain, a very strong part of the public domain. Entrance into the Leadenhall, the public spaces, the Welsh Parliament, Assembly, where the whole ground is public, where anybody can go through it, and where basically the Parliament and the library are below ground, or security is below ground, therefore that people can come in at any time of day or night, and then look down on their parliamentarians making laws, which is the right relationship, the public above and the people who are making law below, and there's what we call a big democratic roof stretching over it. Developers, the house builders, one of the strange things in this country, one of the many strange things in housing terms, whereas nearly any Western country that I can think of, is usually the local authority, who make decisions about plans, planners, engineers and so on, decide what sort of mixed growing they want, what sort of houses, and then the builders, house builders, build them out. In this country, we ask the volume house builders to do the planning. Of course, we get exactly what I've got here. dolls' houses, I call it, on one, looking at the Thames. Actually, they don't look at the Thames. They look down across, they look away from the Thames, and the complete out-of-scale housing, again, on the overlooking the Thames. Because in the end, house builder would admit their aim is the bottom line. It's an economic aim. We've done a lot of work on looking at different types of low-cost housing. This is a Y cube, but we've also got prefabricated buildings which come as volume buildings and so on, which go, basically the buildings are constructed in a week, the materials are put together in another week. So it takes you 2 weeks to create a sheltered space, and now we're beginning to get quite a large number of interest. It's been a tremendous uphill battle, because again, one is dominated by the traditional house builders. Much more advanced, but unfortunately not going ahead in Korea. Low-cost housing, absolutely standardized, totally made of steel apart from the concrete core. It was a house. It was the automobile and shipbuilders who were our financiers, and we created a capsule that came on the back of a truck, and you put one on top of the other, and by twisting it in one direction or another, you get variations, terraces, and views. And finally, in term is where it probably started from, our DNA, if you like, which is a house for my parents, which is about flexibility, adaptability, change. Now my grandchildren live and children live in the house. It used to be my parents, as I mentioned. And the idea of light, transparency, and a simple expression of structure. And summarizing what I've been talking about, we're looking at a way of supporting a range of uses, live, work, leisure, including both the poor and the rich in a real mix, not a ghettoized mix. Obviously, architects have limited in all these situations, but this is what we're aiming for. Environmental responsibility, the most critical thing that we're looking at a global level, a mankind level, encouraging walking and walking that's integrated with public transport, well-designed, adaptable to change, secure and just. Again, a compact city is secure. Immediately start to build out the compact city. In suburbia, it's less secure. But worst of all, let's again take some of our own cities as where you have brownfield, massive brownfield within the city. And we have actually 31,000 buildable hectares of brownfield in England. We have probably more than any country, because after all, we were the great industrial nation, and we probably manufacture less than anybody else, not more big-scale manufacturing. So we have the brownfield. That doesn't allow for intensification around hubs. We did a study. There are 600 hubs in London. If you built 100 houses on each hub, which would be easier, in other words, sort of local, where there's a shop and a bus stop and so on, you would have more than enough housing. And already up to under Ken Livingstone, and then 98% of all building has gone on brownfield. So the brownfield is there. Immediately start put it outside, even if it's Ebbsfleet. You're not only encouraging walking, discouraging walking, but also, of course, you're encouraging cars. But most seriously, you're leaving the brownfield. In this situation, is Thames Gateway as brownfield. It's insecure, unpleasant, and amazingly wasteful. Thank you very much. Have I done it in 10 minutes?
Going to be the longest 10 minutes in my life. I have decided, because I have so little time, first to tell what I've decided not to tell about. And then I'll tell about what I will like to tell about. But I will start with this one. Yesterday, Copenhagen, big day. Copenhagen this year is the sustainable or the green capital of Europe, and we've been very green all year. It's not quite Copenhagen, but anyway. And then yesterday we stopped that year and handed it over to Bristol, who will be the capital next year. And everything was very green, and it was not quite greenwashing, which is something which is very, very widespread. And when I see these greenwashing things, I start to think about if the people there is having a good life, or if it's just the plants who is happy here. And this is about all these silos where you go for one sector at a time. I think sustainable cities, that's quite fine, but people cities will do more, and it will be something about that. What we want in the 21st century is lively, livable cities, sustainable and healthy cities. So I'm not going into what I'm not going to talk about because we haven't got time. But if we had time, I will talk about that we have had these paradigms for 50 years now, the modernism and the auto-invasion panic, where we've done everything to make the cars happy. But now we have this distinct change of paradigm. And I will also point that if we are to make lively, livable, sustainable and healthy city, it's a very good starting point to be very kind to the pedestrians, to the public life and to the bicyclists, because by addressing this, you will actually achieve all this. With one stone, you can kill 3 birds. And I'm so sorry for the birds, but I think it's a rather good way of putting it. So I'm not going again to tell about Copenhagen. I've told about that so often, but do we know of cities who have a distinct policy in this city will do whatever we can to have people walk and bicycle as much as possible? Yes, we have several examples by now, and one of them being Copenhagen, which you've forgotten your list of livable cities, by the way. It's always number 1. But Copenhagen started actually 52 years ago to push the cars back from the main street. Nobody believed it could ever happen in Scandinavia. We were Danes, we were not Italians, and then they pushed the cars out and we were Italians just next year and been more and more Italians ever since. Just to give you an idea about, yes, this again I'm not going to talk about it, but this was the first pedestrian scheme in Copenhagen, and if we go back to the Copenhagen city center now, it looks like this. All these places have been addressed. I could have, if I had time, talk about the four phases of this humanization of the public spaces. The first phase, 20 years, were about better conditions for walking, for promenading, making streets. The next phase in the 80s until 2000 was about making more room for staying and recreation. That was the squares. The third phase in the 21st century has been more and more geared towards fun, enjoyment, playing, sports, activities. And this is all well and fine. But I think that the main thing about a city like Copenhagen is now it's not about the city center. It's about the whole city, where they do a lot of things to make the city a nice place for people walking, people, public life and bicycles all over the city. All the streets look like that. All the streets just about look like this now. Much more beautiful, much more safe, much more people-friendly, very good for walking. And I'll just tell this little example that a part of this citywide policy of making it better for people, they, as a matter of the normal thing to do, they take the sidewalks and the bicycle lanes across all the minor streets when they come into a bigger street. They narrow the street, whatever, that's fine. Priority for people, they are just as important as any guy in a Mercedes-Benz. But then I talked to my daughter and she said, would you imagine they made this new system in our area? And now granddaughter Laura, who is 7, she can now walk to school because she can stay on the sidewalk all the way to school. She doesn't have any more to cross 3 streets. And of course, when you're 7, you don't cross streets. You will have to be carried there or taken by car, whatever. But now Laura can do it on her own, and this is a way of making a better city for people. Copenhagen now have this policy. We will be the best city in the world for people in a few years. And then I could go on and talk, but I haven't got time, and talk about that in Copenhagen. They've got enormous many things for bicycles, and now 41% of everybody coming to work or studies in Copenhagen's city come on bicycles. We have problems in Copenhagen, very serious problems, congestion on bicycle lanes, really bad, has been bad for quite a while. And do we put everybody up in the third floor in the westerly wind? And do we look upon bicycling as just a way to get from A to B? No, bicycling is a way of life. Bicycling is about having fun and looking at the girls at the sidewalk and all this. And this is absolutely nonsense. So what we do is just to double the size of the bicycle lanes. And where do we have the asphalt from? We take it from the cars again and again. And now we have, it's good economy, because you can have 5 times more people on a bike lane than you can in a car lane. So it's good economy. They also have this policy, will be the best for bicycles in the world. And I could go on if I had time, but I will, this is what I'm not going to talk about. That we could talk about what all the things they've done to make it better for people in Melbourne. We could talk about what they're about to do in Sydney. We can talk about what they have done for a long time now in New York. We could even talk about the miracle of Moscow, and they can do it in 1.5 years. Moscow in the old days with parking on the sidewalk on Main Street, and now you come back and there are no parking, there are benches all the way. Grey Street has become Green Street. Even the advertisements has disappeared. You can see Kremlin in the distance. Miraculous. So there are many examples. This is another sign of all the goodwill around the world. My firm has not been involved in this particular thing, but it's the spirit I like here to show that this is for people, and bicyclists are sort of people. So we don't like this. If we look at the list from Monocle on the most livable cities in the world, there is a distinct pattern here. Not only that no British city is mentioned in any of the lists, but that all the yellow or yellowish ones are ones which have distinct people-first policies. And I would say that there is a link between people-first policies and being livable, whatever. So, I could end here, but I'm not. It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that people swing. If the people are not happy, it doesn't matter if it's very healthy or if it's very green. It's not enough about to do people washing. You have to be really serious, because making it inviting for people is really an art, and you have to do that. So, now comes the thing I would like to talk about, but I'll do it very quickly. I have brought here to London a livability test, and that comes from my meeting with Mrs. Larn in the Danish embassy in Hanoi. She's just been in Copenhagen for a course at the Danish foreign ministry, and she was back in Hanoi, and she approached me and my wife and said, "Do you have a baby boom in Copenhagen?" And we said, "Baby boom in Copenhagen? No, we have a reproduction problem. We'll be no more Danes in 200 years. And we certainly have no baby boom." But she said, "No, that cannot be true, because I saw all these babies." Of course, we have 1 year maternity leave, and what can you do there except pushing your pram around? But then in Copenhagen, you see a lot of children, because you can take the children out on the sidewalks, and you can especially take them on the bicycle lanes. 30% of all families have a cargo bike, and they carry the kids on these cargo bikes all over the place. And the kids like to be in a cargo bike much more than they like to be strapped in a car. And they do it in the winter also, it's a little bit harder. Every bike can take 2, maybe 3 kids, and they do. And they start very early in Copenhagen to learn to bicycle. And I know from my daughter again that the moment you have good bicycle infrastructure, you can take kids of 4 or 5 years for long distances through the city, and as long as it's safe and it's good infrastructure, you can do it, and they do. And the Copenhagen lullaby would be, of course, like this, and you can see them walking all over the place. So I realized that Mrs. Larn, she thought we had a baby boom, because what she saw in Copenhagen was a lot of children in the city. In Hanoi, you cannot bring the children into the city, because it's too dangerous, it's too polluted, it's too crowded, whatever. So the children are hidden. And my conclusion here is that many cities children present in a city is a sure sign of quality and livability. And I could also add, many children and old people in a city is a sure sign of quality and livability. So let's go out there and see how many children you can see tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Now, I guess I'm picking up on a bit of a theme. We, Arup, are working in a whole variety of different city situations across the globe at the moment. And it feels to me like the globe and the world is changing faster, certainly, than I've certainly ever experienced. But then again, you're looking at me thinking he's very, very young. So in that respect, maybe I'm merely reflecting my age and stage. But as we look around the globe, we see phrases like urban resilience coming up, and the way in which cities are adapting themselves to future events, to future stresses. We see phrases like dealing with climate change and the way in which we're designing places. And this is the Olympic Park flooding last year. It flooded 9 times last year, and thanks to its design, it coped with that. It was deliberate, and that saved about 5,000 homes further south. This is flicking through. I'll keep going. Someone's trying to speed me up here. Saved about 5,000 homes further south from flood risk. This is China, where we're dealing with population growth, rapid population growth, trying to create cities from nothing, if you like, in super quick time. We're working in Japan at the moment. We're facing exactly the opposite situation, where we're facing population declining and aging population. The way in which people want to live in cities is quite different if you're dealing with a population over the age of 65 to one which is a lot younger. And of course, the younger population are more demanding than ever because they have the means to be so through social media, the instantaneous response, if you like, to something they don't like. So how do we deal with that? Well, one of the ways in which it's very easy to deal with that is to engage with people following a disaster or following an event. You can use the event, if you like, to your advantage, and we see that across the globe at the moment, whether it's post-riot, post-major event, post-apartheid, where we're working in the city of Tshwane, the former capital Pretoria of South Africa, post-Hurricane Sandy. You see the lights have gone out in New York. It's very easy to engage with citizens of New York at the moment in talking about how to change their city when they've experienced something like this. But it's a lot harder when you start to come to some of the issues that we're facing in the UK at the moment in terms of the way in which we grapple with the housing crisis, or we grapple with the need for changes to the economy. Now, Richard said, I really don't want to upset Richard, but he said he really doesn't like the Newtown concept. And yet we, Arup, are working here on the Ebbsfleet proposal. But actually, I would like to give him heart that the Ebbsfleet proposal here actually looks rather like the image he showed us from the early 1990s of the compact city. Because one of the things that politicians, I think, often assume is that when you take a new town, you're actually building it in a place where people are not going to object, and it's actually an easier concept than building within a city. What they fail to realise is that you're designing for a community that doesn't yet exist, and you've got to then try and imagine how a community is going to respond, and respond particularly to an environment which isn't going to be completed for 30 or 40 years. So the compact city principle, I think, is all the more relevant to a new town kind of concept, because you've got to create something from nothing on day one where people want to live. And that's the philosophy we're trying to employ in Ebbsfleet. But then again, you need probably about 50 Ebbsfleets if you're going to tackle the current housing demand in Britain. So I agree with Richard. New towns are not the solution to the challenges we have. So let's turn to the spaces we have within the inner cities, often referred to as the brownfield land. And the problem, I think, is that we're using it up, certainly in places like London. There certainly is brownfield land across the rest of the country, but actually London is finding it increasingly difficult to find those brownfield spots. We've got some tremendous examples of where it has worked, and King's Cross is probably the best. And if you ask any resident, as we did recently, of the estates around King's Cross, what they think about the King's Cross development, you will generally find a very positive response. And one of the things they always say is the reason they're positive about it is they take pride in it. It's given them a new address. They like to say that they live in King's Cross. One of the main reasons behind that, actually, is a gentleman called Roger Madeline, who led Argent and actually went to every single, as far as I recall, every single community meeting that was held in the planning and the design process for this new piece of London. And that pride still exists in being part of that process, not just living adjacent to something new being created. When we then turn actually, and I think this is where we are in terms of Britain's challenge, when we've exhausted our options for new towns, we've potentially exhausted our options for brownfield land, I think we are now at a point where we are starting to think about solving the crisis in different ways. And invariably that means looking at places in London where people live and places in London where people are working. When you ask someone to move house or you ask someone to change the place that they work, to make way for some new change coming in, to make way for dealing with a larger housing crisis, that's where fear arises. That's where the challenge, I think, and the more difficult process needs to be employed in engaging people in understanding what change really means and engaging them in development of trust. That's what we're doing in Tottenham at the moment, and I think you have to work at the pace that people are prepared to work with you on in order to develop a relationship and develop the trust that's needed for them to see some benefit, if you like, and avoid the risk, if you like, of gentrification affecting them negatively. Richard mentioned Croydon. This is a project we're working with Croydon on at the moment. Yes, I agree completely with Richard that there is scope in Croydon, actually, for something of the scale of a new town to be created right in the heart of an existing piece of urban fabric. But the challenge there again is about engaging an existing population in seeing that scope and seeing that potential. And also then asking them frankly to live through that degree of change. And the work here that you see up on the screen, it's not the fancy design work, it's actually the very real process of trying to describe how a place might change around you and where the impacts might be felt as shops close, shops are moved, new residents move in, construction impacts are felt. And I think that exchange of information, that engagement of people in the process and understanding how they can deal with that process is actually the thing that we really need to invest a lot more time in, as well as the design processes. We learnt a lot of this on the Olympics. We learnt that we did need to constantly, not just go through a consultation exercise, but constantly talk to residents affected by what we were doing on the site. We needed to talk to them not just about design, we needed to talk to them about opportunity. And here you see the construction academy that was built as part of the Olympics because people wanted jobs locally. They wanted the Olympic to provide jobs. Only 17% of the people that passed through that academy actually worked on the Olympic sites. The rest went off and worked in construction projects across London. And that is a tremendous offer if you want people to engage in your project. So I guess the overarching message that I'm trying to convey is that design is a tremendous tool. And I'm a planner. Planners often are criticised for their approach to design. I think design is a tremendous tool. And it's a tremendous tool for engaging people in a discussion about realising what change can do for them, realising that change can be for the better, and developing a long-term relationship based on trust where they end up experiencing the kinds of streets, the kinds of places that our two previous speakers have described and enjoying them, taking pride in them, and remaining in the place in which they grew up or they lived, only living in perhaps a different property in doing so. That's my opinion.
There's lots of food for thought in all of those presentations. And also a lot that's very hard to argue with. Every time I see any of these three speak, you go away thinking, yeah, of course, our city is better. That's so obvious, this is the way to do it. But at the same time, there's a lot that's kind of glossed over in the sense of the actual process and the things that are allowed to happen in order for this vision to be realised. And so the first thing I'd like to just ask you all about is this notion of public and public space being the kind of ultimate good. That in all of your writings and your projects, the public realm is referred to as the kind of holy grail. What we've been seeing recently, particularly in London, is that actually public space is no longer public. So Granary Square, public space in King's Cross, when you go there, it says, "Welcome to King's Cross, please enjoy this private estate considerately." The amazing public space beneath the cheese grater, which is an amazing concession to have got the developer to agree to, is also managed by Broadgate Estates, which manages Paternoster Square, where Occupy protesters were successfully evicted and a nice big fence was put up. And in all of, it's not obviously just those two projects, but every new so-called public space in London turns out to be privately managed. So I guess my first question would be, how public does public space have to be successful and livable and something that you would believe in? Maybe beginning with Richard.
I totally agree. Ideally, all public space should be public space. On the other hand, whilst we live in a capitalist world, especially run by pretty extreme capitalists, it's unlikely we're going to get it. So it's better at least to have semi-public space, which is instance, than no public space. I don't know what else to answer. The architect has limited control on that. I mean, there's no one ever asked me, I have to say, nor would I really know how you start. Yes, you could do it through parliament, through society. It goes actually, okay, let's take it a step further. Really what these decisions should be made is not by the developer, but by the council, the elected council. That's how it used to be done, and it needs to be done. Immediately, see, you are going to have the developer, the volume house builder, control the system of planning. This is a uniquely British, by the way, more or less as far as the Western Europe. It doesn't happen. It's there that the council does do the planning. Immediately going to do that, and you ask the developer how many affordable houses are going to buy, or how much open space are going. He's obviously going to look at his bottom line. That's his job. Our job is meant to be to advise the local government how to create public space, social housing, and so on. It's a serious political mistake.
Jerome, could you respond?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Granary Square because many years ago I worked with Argent looking at the strategy, if you like, for the regeneration of their site in King's Cross and the plans. And one of the big debates was of the public spaces, should they be made public and therefore handed over to the local authority to manage, or should they be retained in private ownership by Argent as the developer? And I think, I'm not going to speak for Argent, but I think the decision to keep the space managed in the way in which it is managed was a very deliberate one, born out of a view that the place that they were creating was actually going to change quite significantly over many, many, many years. And you see that at the moment. You see probably only in its first phase of development at the moment, King's Cross, and already it feels like a place that's working. You know, you want to visit it. It doesn't exclude the public, but it feels like an enjoyable place to be. And that's quite deliberate. They have their self-interest at heart. They want to maintain its value and they want it to work. But at the same time, I think it also makes it a very valuable piece of London. It makes it a new piece of London. And as I said in my piece, I think that's the bit of pride that people are pointing to. They feel they don't feel shut out of it. They feel they're welcome and invited to that space to enjoy it. So I don't think there's a harm. There's a great tradition, actually, of the great estates of London creating beautiful public and semi-public spaces within our city here. But it is down to just how public they are then made to be and how inviting they are, if you like, for the general public to enjoy.
Can I just add a little piece on that, which is, when I was advising Ken Livingstone, one of the things which I failed was to try to persuade Ken to do something about actually deprioritising all those squares with gates around it, with possibly one nanny in each square. It isn't viable to have one nanny in each square. It reflects both our society, the nanny, and the fact that you could have a key to the gate. I totally agree with those who want to liberate those spaces.
Mm. Yeah, what do you make of?
Yeah, I would normally say that you can always see the things which are not allowed, to what degree this is a public or semi-public or private space. And generally, of course, the public spaces which are governed by the municipality and policed by the ordinary policemen, they have a much wider range of things you're allowed to do than the more and more privatized spaces inside the shopping malls and whatever. But I think I'll make another point. That is, it was very deliberate that I showed Laura walking to school. And it was very deliberate that I showed that, okay, they can do a lot of things in the center of the city and sort of make it shiny, whatever. But the crucial thing is if it could be made citywide, and if wherever you live, you feel that you are invited, you are welcome as a person. And then I also made the point that there is a close connection between this, because there's it means that people can meet and various generations, whatever, can meet, and it gives a better social inclusion. We think even that it's very good for democracy that we meet in person with other people from society. But also, all this about green mobility, which you also talked a lot about, that we have to walk and bicycle to the public transportation to much higher degree. And the third thing is that the World Health Organization now say to every city in the world, make sure that your citizens walk and bicycle as much as possible in the course of their daily day. So it's not only a matter of King's Cross and what the square there is used for, it's something of the matter of the whole fabric of places where people can be, and that there's no question that it has to be published, and it is public, and it has to be public, and we have to make sure that it's inviting and nice.
Just focusing on London specifically, because that's, I think, the context that most of us are familiar with. I mean, in 2004, you were commissioned by Transport for London to look in depth at London's public spaces. I mean, Richard, obviously, as Chief Advisor to the Mayor and the 100 Public Spaces programme. Looking back at both of those initiatives, how successful do you think they were, and what kind of hasn't actually been achieved in the advice that you both gave at a very high level to the Mayor?
Maybe I would like to start, but of course, Richard would be the one to really answer that. But it has been for me very interesting to have worked in New York, in Moscow, and in Sydney, and Melbourne, and in London, and see that every place, lots of things have happened except in London.
That's why we're not on your livable cities list.
Of course, in Moscow, it took 1.5 years for them to really get rolling, but they have very efficient democracy over there. In New York, they did miracles in just 2 or 3 years because they have a very powerful mayor, and he can say go west, and they go west. It takes a little bit more than in Moscow, but they go west. But here you have a very complicated political structure. You have a rather weak mayor. That means he has no money and no power, and he can advise and sing, but everybody decide what they want to do. So I think that's quite a few things have happened over these years because the world go forward. But it's amazing to see how little of all the things which was pointed out just 10 years ago has actually happened. It's a very much déjà vu to go around in many of the places here, sadly enough.
Richard, what would your take be looking back on what happened to the 100 Public Spaces programme and your kind of principles that you and Ken were trying to champion at the time?
Some of them were built, very few of them, as you know, were built. But there is the beginning of a network through London, which is not just the public spaces. Obviously I'm in London, I'm not quite as negative as you are. We do have bicycles, we didn't have bicycles before, even if they are called somebody else's bicycles, Barclay or and there are, I mean the South Bank, as I mentioned, is as good as anywhere, including Copenhagen, except there's only one piece of London. So we are beginning to see, and we're going to see the Aldwych pedestrianised, we've seen Trafalgar Square, so we're beginning to, but I couldn't agree with you, we're primitive in comparison with yourself, but we have learned a lot, not maybe from that specific studies, all the squares, but there is a culture which has or is arriving here.
And are you optimistic that it's getting better? Because I mean, from my perspective, it seems to be getting a lot worse in terms of the encroachment of developments that have absolutely no recognition of context, of creating a community, of creating an inclusive, livable place in London. Are you more optimistic than me?
Well, I think it isn't getting worse, I would say. Quite clearly, whilst the only people who, and I keep on saying really, I'm sorry to repeat it, the only people who make those decisions has to be the elected people, and that is the neighbourhood controllers, the councils and so on. Whilst you leave it in private hands, of course there'll be ghettos, because why would anybody want to have a luxury lot of apartments with affordable housing below and shopping? That's whilst you leave it in the hands of those where the bottom line, which is the financial line, is the judge. You can't do it. Count the people, not through the fact that they have a direct say, but through the fact that they elect things like councils, have got to have a say at that level.
Just a brief comment, really, as an observer, certainly not as an influencer during the same period. But I think Rich has been rather modest, actually, because I think what we've observed in London is a tremendous change. And the last thing actually that would work in London, I think, is efficient democracy. It's the sense that you could tell a Londoner how to do something, and this here's a plan, and this is how you're going to change your street. Just wouldn't work here. In fact, probably the opposite would happen. So in some senses, I think what we have seen is over, perhaps over the last 15 years, is a change of mindset, a belief that things can change in the city, actually. And I think that has carried across mayors. I think the current mayor believes it just as much as the previous mayor, actually. And when you travel, and I've been doing a lot of travelling recently, and really compare London to a lot of the other, what I would call great cities around the world, you know, you come back here with a tremendous sense of pride because of the transformations that we have seen. You only have to go down to, I don't know, the public square in front of King's Cross, and you think, what was that place like only 5 years ago? And that, to me, we're still seeing the change. I don't agree that we're seeing a negative. I think we're seeing a lot of positive change continuing in the face of quite hard economic times, which makes it all the more difficult to make it continue.
Public transport is one of the big ones. Sorry.
Yeah, I was curious to hear whether this change of mindset also happens in the profession of transport engineers or traffic engineers, because I always had the idea that Great Britain was ruled by traffic engineers, that there were no place in the world where the traffic engineers had so much say than over here. And I really felt that to have really improvements, you have to change the mindset in that particular group.
Yeah.
And I would rejoice when the day comes when you don't have to apply to get across the street all over the country.
Yeah.
If this is a special British thing, they have it in other places also where British traffic engineers have been at large. But this little thing about that you should feel that you are guest in the streets and you are not, is not a human right.
Yeah.
From the United Nations to get across the street. I think that's funny. And I'd like to see them go. Get rid of them.
Get rid of the traffic engineers.
Yeah,
Okay,
now get rid of, you can just start.
Pedestrian engineers.
We have a list of 15 things that traffic engineers came up with worldwide to make it easier for the traffic. All 15 makes it more difficult for Laura and the other pedestrians in the cities. And I think that we should shoot them down one after the other. Not the traffic engineers, but the 15 things they found out. One-way streets is one. This about difficult crossing of streets, objects in the sidewalks, narrow sidewalks, you name it. Tunneling on the streets or having bridges over streets. All this makes it more difficult to be a person and makes it more nice to be a car.
Yeah. I must introduce you to some Arup traffic engineers.
Retaliate during the Q&A. Another major London issue that wasn't touched on in the presentations is the issue of tall buildings. And I know, Jan, from your work, I think you've said that good cities, livable cities, must be between 6 and 7 stories tall. I mean, London has, I think, 230 live planning applications and buildings on site that classify as tall buildings. What do all three of you think of the quality of those proposals? And again, I suppose a question particularly for Richard, given the policy under Ken was pro tall buildings. You know, how do you think it's turned out?
I don't think it has anything to do with, I'm sorry, there we do disagree about the tallness of buildings. I think there are some amazing streets in New York. John is, by the way, on a positive side, even New York, which is meant to be the city made for cars, is beginning to become much more humanized. It has improved greatly in many parts. And it's to do with what the public domain does. Height is not to me, it's the right height in the right place, and the right mix of all those things are important. As to what the tall buildings look like, I would argue today that if I had to make a choice, probably the tall buildings are slightly better designed than the low buildings.
From what you've seen of live planning applications, just in general, the tall buildings are better designed than the low rise?
On the whole, if I take, say whatever it is, you say 200, I don't know them all, but that doesn't matter.
Sure.
But if I take 200 low rise, I don't know what it is, 8 stories, I'm sure my point is they're probably worse designed. There's nothing worse than, let's say, that if we want to be in a wealthy area, than the north side of the Thames, opposite the Take Bank side. I mean, how can you do that? That's low rise.
Jerome, what's your take on tall buildings?
I certainly think you know, the design, the good design of a tall building is where you meet it at the ground, and then the experience of a tall building is, you know, we've got a hell of a lot of really bad examples of that in London, many of which have been blown up and brought down. But at the same time, I think that lesson has been learnt. I think a lot of the applications that you're talking about are challenged in that way. They're challenged to prove that they work at the ground. I think what I would say the bigger concern, perhaps with tall buildings, is their long-term economic use. And we see at the moment, we talked about Croydon, but we see one of the challenges in somewhere like Croydon with the recent changes to the planning regulations. You know, the ability to convert from commercial to residential very quickly now has meant a big rush to do so. And I think there's a risk that you do so out of ignorance, if you like. You assume you can change one building to another without careful thought, and I think there is a danger that we create just the same problems, only different occupiers, if we're not careful about it. So what I would like to see, perhaps through the planning process, is a greater degree of challenge applied to new applications for buildings to demonstrate that they are capable of reuse for different purposes. And I think that would really help both with the ground level interaction, but also then the economic long-term future of the building itself.
Yeah. Do you still defend your 6 to 7 story policy?
Absolutely, absolutely. I have argued in many of my books about this, which comes from the human senses and the fact that when there's a number of things there, but I'll take on another one. That is the climatic effect, because if we go around and see what the areas are like when you have a lot of high buildings, I make in my book of Cities for People, I make the point that in all the countries which are hit by westerly winds from the Atlantic and the North Sea, we should stay away from high buildings, because they create extra wind at ground level and they create quite a bit more shade. I have this example from Rotterdam, which was destroyed by Luftwaffe during the war and was rebuilt with a lot of high-rise, and seeing people in a windy morning going to the station, all of them trying to protect their umbrellas. Instead of the umbrellas protecting people, they are trying to protect the umbrellas because of the gusting wind, and going then over to Amsterdam and see everybody go around between the buildings in Amsterdam being protected by the umbrellas. Whatever we can say about high-rise, and we can say a lot of nice things, and that will be said, but I think that we have to look carefully into the climate issue, because if we are to walk and bicycle, we must make the best climate we can make. And say in a city like Sydney, they have managed to have the whole city centre without a ray of sunshine. And in Melbourne, they have managed to make a valley of sunshine along the main street, which is a hell of a difference between Sydney and Melbourne. So make nice climate at eye level and then build as high as you can. Actually, in San Francisco, they had a vote. Would you like more wind and less sunshine, or would you like it as it is now? And then everybody said that they would like it as it was now. So they have not built high-rise in San Francisco for 20 years, because they have this rule that if you put shade on the opposite sidewalk, or if you create more wind, forget about it. And that has actually been a quality rule about protect our climate. And with all this outdoor life we want and need, then we have to look carefully into the climate factor.
Given all three of your experience of working overseas and in so many different global cities, what do you make of London, the current situation of London and the UK's planning system? Because the impression I get is that a lot of the mistakes, if you trace back where in the process they happened, it's to do with the current kind of Faustian pact that the UK planning system is, particularly the Section 106 agreement, the kind of planning game that planners will allow developments to get more and more bloated, taller and taller, more and more aggressive, so they can cream off the fat for the kind of tax, essentially, to pay for public benefits. Just a kind of general question about the UK planning system as compared to other global cities that you've worked in, perhaps beginning with
The planner.
The planner, exactly.
It's a really interesting one. I mean, I would certainly say that we've messed around with the planning system over the last 10, 15 years far too much, actually, because I think one of the beauties of the principle of the British planning system is that there is a high degree of negotiation and flexibility built into it. You don't actually need to change it very much in order to preserve that. But that means that you need a strong local authority or government steer and strong local government prepared to stand up for design quality, etc., and be, stand up in the case of the inspectorate or whoever it takes. I think when you go abroad, however, you do realise that the British planning system perhaps is a lot better than we think of it here. I think you do see zonal systems, for example, creating monocultures in some cities. American cities, you see that. I mean, Detroit almost suffered from something along those lines, but albeit that it was dependent on a single industry. But you see that kind of zonal effect not delivering the kind of mix, the city mix that your Italian Renaissance slide actually tries to convey. And so I think to a great extent that flexibility built into the British planning system that we see the results of in London has delivered some good. I have to say, I think more recently it's up in the air actually, and I think there is confusion about what the planning system is about, what it's for, what we're trying to use Section 106 for at the moment, and a lot more clarity needs to be given, I think, by government and strength to local government in managing it if it's going to be achieving the kinds of things we want it to achieve.
Jan, can I ask your opinion? Having worked in so many different cities around the world, how does the UK system compare?
I would say that this is an area I don't know too much about, and when you talk about these figures and this ordinance with that number, whatever, I don't know what it is all about. Because what I've mostly been doing is walking around at eye level and see the results in new districts, in old districts, in medieval cities, in this and the other city. And so I haven't spent much time thinking about the planning system. But just to mention one thing, that I do think that some of the best new areas I've seen recently has been Swedish, because they are not so good architects in Sweden, that by the way, but they are very good in making districts. And I think that, again, interestingly, Ralph Erskine has had a great influence in Sweden, and that tradition from Ralph Erskine and his strong humanism and strong ability to make the big story, the medium story, and the little tiny scale, all of them good, has sort of sifted into the Swedish system. So when I speak about housing in Copenhagen, I would always say that the best housing in Copenhagen is just across the bridge in Sweden, which is true.
Richard, what do you think is wrong with the current system, if anything?
Starting the other way around from your question, which is, I think there's some very good examples abroad. And if you look at what Germany is doing, what Hamburg has extended, if you look at what, again, of course, Denmark has done, what Holland is doing, what Sweden, Norway, Finland, and so on, they are well ahead of us, well ahead of us. If you look at what Barcelona has done, which in a way could be argued that proves your point, that Barcelona basically is all 8 stories, and I think there is a break-up, by the way. 8 stories, you go above trees at around 8 stories. So you start to get that dominance. Having said that, it doesn't mean you always want trees taller than buildings. But I think that there are examples, and we have to ask ourselves, how have we descended? I think we are now worse than we've ever been before, because we've taken all the competence out of the planners. There are very few architects, and I know I was an architect, started being a long time ago, like 50 years ago, but when I started being an architect, 80% of all architects worked for schools, hospitals, local authorities, housing and so on. Today, a tiny amount work. And now, I'm not saying it should all be public, but the point is, there's a big change of responsibility. It's all gone in the way of, it's got to be about economics, and therefore the volume house builder, the office developer is in charge. It shouldn't be that way. If you want what you're talking about, which is the mix, which I totally agree, you can't expect the developer to do it because he's the wrong animal.
There are so many more topics on my list, from gentrification, which we haven't even touched on yet, to cycling, garden cities, new towns, so many things. But it's time to hand over to the audience, so you have a full half hour of asking your own questions. So I think maybe if we take two at a time to smooth things along a bit. Does anyone have something they want to kick off with? Or shall I carry on with my list?
Here's your choice.
We'll go for the first one here, and the second one in red over there. So,
Just quickly, to what extent, this is probably more directed at Jerome, but any of the panellists really, to what extent do you think kind of the mania for kind of mega cultural projects such as Olympics and World Expos that many cities are pursuing at the moment, how far do you think they can contribute to livable cities?
Okay.
And then we'll take the second question at the same time, and then you can answer both together.
So I just wanted to ask what you think is the relationship between surveillance and livable cities. I thought it was interesting that, Jan, you talked about a city inviting people and to walk and cycle. And one of the things that's led to a reduction in cars in London is the congestion charge, which is policed by cameras, as just kind of one example of how we're kind of increasingly watched and tracked. And I'm interested to know what your perspective on that is.
Could you hear that? I couldn't.
Okay, it was about, just to clarify, could the audience hear that, just so we can check if the microphones are working?
Yeah.
It was about the role of increasing surveillance on cities, if our cities are becoming too surveyed, I think. So the first one was about the role of expos and mega events in creation of cities.
Yeah, really good question. I know it's a hot topic at the moment, with particularly with Oslo actually pulling out of their Olympic bid at the moment. There's a big question mark about what they can contribute and whether there's good value behind them. Interestingly, the survey of the public survey held last year, I think, on was the London Olympics considered good value for money, I think returned something like 65 or 70% in favour of it being good value for money from a London perspective, which is maybe alarming compared to perhaps the way people felt when it was won or midway through the process of building it, with the kind of figures that were being talked about. I personally, and having been through that experience, think that those kind of events can make a huge contribution. I think there's some very, very good examples. I think Barcelona is a fantastic example of how you can use those kind of events to your benefit. But I think that's the key, that you need actually to understand what you want out of them right from the beginning before you ever consider bidding for them. And in London's case, I think the mayor of Newham said it himself, there'd been 88 master plans for the site before the Olympics came along and actually delivered something. And in that respect, the Olympics was a tremendous catalyst for changing something which had been dreamt about for many, many decades, actually, and really brought it to fruition. I think there are probably other examples globally where that kind of long-term thought process and ambition may not exist, and therefore the risk is that the event becomes just that, an event for 6 weeks, and it moves on at tremendous public expense. So I think the short answer, frankly, is I think there's huge potential in those events. They should be used, however, within and set within the context of that long-term ambition. And unless you have that long-term ambition, I wouldn't bother bidding.
But is it alarming as on principle that we need to spend £12 billion of public money in order to build a few thousand homes? I suppose is the broader message behind the question. Should we be relying on mega events to do basic urban things, creating housing, creating new stations, roads, things like that?
Well, my comment would be 88 master plans. It was an incredibly difficult place to develop, leaving it to the private sector alone.
I think, on that question, I don't know overall how you make a judgment. I suppose, as you have already said, it depends how well you design the Olympics with a long-term investment. It has to be a long-term investment. It can't be £12 million for running around a track like that cannot be. If you are regenerating a whole area, it was extremely depressed. And I sit on the Doctors of the World. We work in the third world. Believe it or not, we have a place in East London because it's so bloody poor if we compare to the third world. So there is a problem there, and that if it starts to solve those problems, then it does something. That's really what it's about. Whether 12 million is the right price, I wouldn't know.
Jan, would you like to respond to either one of the two?
Yeah, I'll try with the question from over there, which I couldn't quite hear. And that sort of raises a general question. Speak close to the microphone when you're posing questions. But if I understood your translation correct, was about this surveillance which are popping up increasingly in the cities. And I think we have tonight we have touched on the safety issue. You mentioned that if we build more compact and we walk and bicycle more and there are more life in the streets and people, there are more mixed use so that it will be 24-hour cities, that all this has an impact on increased safety. I mentioned these examples from Copenhagen with all the children all over the place, which is a good sign that it's reasonably safe, so that we know that a people-friendly city is generally a safer city, and we will need less gated, and we will need no gated community, whatever. And I don't quite know what all these cameras do if you have a nice city anyway. But we must fight extremely hard to prevent all these good ideas of gating up places, of making them more private, of having security forces in premises where the public have access to, so that we increasingly are reminded about being afraid and whatever. So we have to work hard for, I mentioned the word democracy and social inclusion in connection with the public realm, and we have to work hard all the time to maintain this, that it should be public, it should be for all, it should be as safe as we can make it, and we shall make it a democratic public space as best we can. And all the time this is sort of attacked, this notion, but we have to fight hard to keep it there, because that's very valuable.
I'd just like Richard to respond to the same question, because in 1997, writing about gated communities in Los Angeles, he said a new type of citadel has emerged. At the touch of a button, access is blocked, bulletproof screens activated, bomb-proof shutters roll down. The appearance of the wrong sort of person triggers quiet panic. And then a few years later, he builds One Hyde Park, which I think by any measure is the most high security, exclusive, protective enclave in London. So just given those two principles, how would you respond to that?
How rude of you.
That's my role.
I have to turn around and ask you, is your house gated?
No, I live in...
That is how a series of houses on top of each other. They'll never be non-gated because that's a private block. I don't know. I never understood this argument. I'm totally with what you said. I'm totally against surveillance, but it's difficult to stop surveillance into somebody's private house. What is important is there should be more mix. There should be more transparency. The council should say, I mean, the good news of number One Hyde Park is that we've got I think it's 46% of affordable housing somewhere else, in nearby at least. So that's the good news. The bad news is, again, the local authority hasn't got the power to turn those lower build blocks, for instance, the entrances, all the way through. But the architect doesn't have the power there. It's got to be the local authority.
More questions?
I do think surveillance is absolutely critical to one of the most important problems we're facing. That if, all those areas, I'm just strengthening that point, where you go to a shopping centre where you can't be, if you're a hoodie, you can't go in. You can't have a sort of Oxfam. You won't get Oxfam in there because they don't pay their rent and so on. You only can get, people can pay that. It is a serious problem. I think surveillance is one of the basic problems we're facing.
More questions? We've got one over here.
My question is mainly for Jan, but I'd like to hear Richard's opinion on this as well. So Jan, looking back to your report in 2004, Richie put forward a series of recommendations to help change London to become more pedestrian friendly. You described the recommendations as part of a larger process, a process of changing the culture of the city to enable sustainable citywide change in the long term. So I'm interested to hear what you felt the culture and the mindset of the city was back in 2004, 10 years ago. And now, 10 years on, do you feel this culture and this condition you spoke of before has progressed in any way in London?
And we'll just take the second question while we're...
I would like to make a question to the panel to ask how do you think we should transform the streets kind of full of Victorian single-family houses that is kind of very inherited with this country to make it lively neighborhoods.
Okay, Jan, if you'd like to respond to the first question.
Yeah, I think that, frankly speaking, when we were commissioned to work with London and I started to come here regularly, I was quite shocked to see how badly people generally was treated. If you compare, say, to Paris, where sort of many ways man is king on the sidewalks, whatever. Here I felt really that everything had been done to make it lousy. We made that report. We started to do some very basic thing. We had said that you should be able to get along on the sidewalk. You should be able to get around if you were disabled. You should be able to get across the streets, and it should be nice at night. It should be nice to look at, and you should be able to talk to your fellow citizens in the public spaces. And then we started to analyze the spaces and found that they were lacking in nearly all these places. And we made a list of a number of things, which some of them very low-hanging fruits, which could be picked up. I have not been here so much the last 5 years. I wouldn't know too much about how the mindset has changed. I sense it has, and I can see nice projects here and there have been done. But I think that maybe Richard would be able to speak more about that particular question.
Would you like to respond, Richard?
What was the question? Sorry.
It was about the change in culture in London.
What has happened since 2004?
I think there has been a mindset, but I am very much, it's very slow. We have a very strong transportation system, rather good at that, at public transport. We have a tremendously big car lobby that we are beginning to charge for things, but we have a long way to go. To be anything like Copenhagen, we are not anywhere near it.
Shall I pick up on the other question about the Victorian?
Yeah, just to clarify, was it about how to revive empty Victorian terraces in places like Liverpool, or just generally?
Yeah, in general, the whole England has like a massive heritage of housing. How we do it, how we densify the area.
How to densify existing residential areas.
Okay, well, the first thing I would say is that one of the things that sort of characterises London for the better, despite perhaps some of the more negative views I might be, I think is its tremendous historical housing stock, and I wouldn't just point to the Victorians. Actually, the housing stock that goes pre-Victorian, the Georgian stock, for example, some of the highest density housing in Europe was built in the Georgian era. And there's a lot we can learn from looking at that stock and the way in which it was built and the way in which it has been converted actually over the last few hundred years to serve different purposes, different uses. Mayfair is an amazing example, I think, of how you can really take some historical precedents and bring it up to the current. So I don't think it's a case of getting rid of. I think there is an argument for looking at where we can densify and looking at opportunity. And I think Richard said it in his presentation. You know, we have, I think you said 600 stations or interchanges across London, which I suspect, I'm not sure every single one of them, but the vast majority could cope with a lot more densification than we're seeing. And there's no doubt a ripple that can be achieved around those places, because invariably a lot of those places were created post-Victorian period and created in a town planning and a design environment actually which didn't create good streets, didn't create good places. So there's a lot through densification that can also be achieved, I think, in changing the places around those stations and around those environments. I would start with those before ever we start to look at the historical housing stock that is so frankly celebrated and characterises the city.
May I just add a little piece of that one? I mean, I'm not quite sure. I was wondering whether you're talking about the situation where many of these buildings are empty. That's a taxation question in my mind. In other words, we should be taxing empty built spaces, not bedrooms, it's buildings that we should be worrying about. And the other question, I suppose, is greater mix, which is in a sense what you're bringing, especially around transportation hubs and so on. I mean, on the whole, like you, most of those Victorian areas work rather well in the sense of activity. It's the poverty of mix problem which is critical. Better public transport again, better bicycling.
Maybe just extend that question a little bit. You know, some of the principles that you laid out in the Urban Task Force report, you know, about kind of densifying and building on brownfield sites and building tall in those areas. How well do you think those have been applied, you know, over the last 20 years?
We have achieved. We were at, if I remember when we started Task Force 20 years ago, I think it was about 68% of brownfield use. And we went up to 80%, and of course London went up to 98%, which is amazing. By the way, I disagree. We're running out of brownfield. If I may say, all the figures I see is that, funnily enough, there's as much brownfield coming on as we're using. Generally, the thing is nearly static, but yeah, probably less, maybe less easy to build up. So in that sense, we've done extremely well. Public transport depends where, but overall we've done better, especially buses, I think, just in general. Bicycles a little bit better sometimes. I mean, in that sense, greater mix. I think it's a greater consciousness. The sad part, and obviously I'm biased because I did this report. The sad part is, now is that where we all say that, well, what we really want to do is to give people the power, which is what the concept of the government's point. What it actually has meant is that people haven't been given the power because every time they object, they're allowed to apply to the minister. So it's kind of even more centralized than it used to be. You need a proper government framework with proper professionals working in it, or consultants being called into it.
Can we take some more questions? Okay. I'll jump at the front. Any from that side? You've been a bit quiet so far. Yeah.
Not you, but
Hello. We know that cities will become over-densified in the next 30 to 40 years, and it is calculated that 66% of population will refugee to these cities. What's the plan and visions of US architects and planners for this future? And do you think that the existing role models, as in Barcelona and Copenhagen, as you referred, will respond to the needs of the public spacing?
Is there a second microphone?
My question to the panel is in relation to the brownfield development we've talked about and how it's beneficial to physically and infrastructure-wise, how it's affecting people that are living there, the issue of gentrification, how residents are being displaced and pushed out of areas where they live, especially in brownfield sites that are inner urban, and just your opinion on that topic.
Who would like to go?
I'll tackle the second one, which is easier. Brownfield, first one needs more thinking. Brownfield does not include buildings. I know, I mean, if you take East Manchester, which we have worked on, when before the Commonwealth, well, East Manchester, 4 out of 5 dwellings were empty or derelict. The only what people left there were either the sick or the very old, which I suppose you could, or very, very poor. There's no question it's a lot better than it was. So if we're talking about brownfield, if you're talking about retrofitting buildings, I don't know of anybody objecting to retrofitting buildings. I haven't seen those problems. I don't think those are an obvious problems.
Can I make a comment perhaps on both? I mean, the first thing I would say about global population growth and densification, etc. I think I've thought about this. The statistics are really interesting and fascinating, and we are seeing huge growth. But we're seeing growth in places. You know, we're seeing rapid growth in places like China, India, etc. We're also seeing, you know, population decline in places like Japan. And I think what we're actually seeing across the globe is this kind of evolution of cities through and at different cities at different stages in their lifespan, if you like. And that leads to very different challenges depending on where you're looking at them from and where you're experiencing them from. You know, I think one of perhaps the biggest challenges that we might face globally, and particularly in the places experiencing growth at the moment, is that there is a shift, I think, from cities being a place of necessity. In other words, you have to go there to get a job in order to earn money, in order to survive, if you like, which is perhaps where British cities came from out of the Industrial Revolution, to places of choice where you decide, perhaps the middle classes, perhaps more often than not, are able to choose whether they're going to live in Copenhagen or London or New York, because they've got the transferable skills and the mobility and the wealth, frankly, to enable them to make those kind of choices, in which case the cities actually have to adapt to appeal. And that leads to quite different decisions being made in the way in which the city evolves and the city is designed. And I think that's what we're perhaps seeing, actually. We're seeing perhaps a lot more of the older economies going through that period of appeal and competition, frankly, in order to gather the sort of more highly skilled, perhaps, because they need to compete. And in the East, perhaps, we're seeing more of the cities born out of necessity, actually beginning just to get into that period of transformation into choice. And I think that's a real challenge, because the rapidity of growth and the rapidity of creation of some of those cities may well have led to difficulties in their forward evolution as they turn into places that people might actually choose to want to live in. So I think actually that might be one of the greater challenges that we face over the coming few decades. And densification, I think, is an inevitability, actually, wherever we are, particularly where we're experiencing growth. I do want to comment on gentrification, because it's a subject close to my heart, because we had a bit of a debate about it before we came on stage, about the issues of gentrification, and I think someone around the table said, this is a hot new topic in London, and I would say it's not a new topic at all. It's been an issue for many decades, and it is born out of the way in which land economics work, by and large, particularly when you start to redevelop places particularly where they might, for example, be in local authority control historically, so old housing estates or old local authority land, etc. The economics have to work in order to make change happen, and that change can be for the better of residents, especially residents who are living in poor accommodation at the moment or unsuitable sized accommodation, etc. It can be for the better, but it needs to be highly managed. And again, I think it probably comes back to the point that Richard makes, that you need the strength, frankly, to exist within those client bodies, within particularly those public sector bodies, who are contemplating the release of those lands. Now, when I refer to the lack of brownfield land in London, I think one of the challenges is that there is brownfield land, but more often than not, it's not realised because it sits in an ownership that isn't necessarily declaring it as brownfield. And that's the challenge that we face, that we need to turn those into opportunities. But the opportunity needs to be both for the existing residents as much as it is for bringing new in. I think it's perfectly possible. It's a matter of scale, and it's a matter of strength, of conviction, actually, in the landowner, as well as seeing not just a capital return for themselves, but seeing the transformation as being the creation of something special and something unique that generates growth and change for their communities.
Can I just say three things on that? One is that people come to cities for jobs and to meet people, many parts, exchange ideas. And you aren't going to stop that, especially as there's very little demand for population in farmland any longer. So they're all going to continue to grow. The question then is, how do you humanize it? The good news about cities is they're much more sustainable in energy terms than sprawl. So that's good news. So you need a certain compactness. Just to slightly revert, you could argue that an elevator is much more efficient than a street, by the way, especially in energy terms. But you don't meet people in an elevator. But the point I wanted to make is that I think that we should welcome it. I don't think it's a problem. As long as we design it, and I use design in the broader sense, we control the design, if you like, control the plan.
Jan, did you have some
Sorry.
points to pick up?
Yeah. I do think that it's all the questions we have touched on here in relation to Britain and London is of course very valid and very interesting, but the really great problems in this world of course is in the fast growing cities in the developing countries. And I do think that maybe I'll quote Enrique Peñalosa, who used to be mayor in Bogota. He said many things, but one of the things he said is, it's amazing that we know so much more about good habitat for mountain gorillas and Siberian tigers than we know about good urban habitat for Homo sapiens. And he went along in Bogota to introduce, to do something which could be for everyone. He said that if we can have greater mobility for the poor people in this country, this city, they could go around and seek opportunities and seek jobs without spending half the life in a rattling bus in congestion. So he spent all the money, not on roads, but on sidewalks, on bicycle lanes, and on bus rapid transport systems. So he had this vision, and he said it was a social policy of getting better economy in society to get the poor people mobile by using their own energy and by having cheap, fast public transportation. Deep in my heart, I do believe that it's a very sure thing to make cities for people. That means that we shall take departure point in the biological development history of Homo sapiens. And if we look at where we are very comfortable today, where we go on holidays, whatever, in the districts in London, where we go, we find that they have a fine correspondence with our senses and our body and the way we move, whatever. And to me, that is a very safe thing to do also in the fast-growing cities. And it's the cheapest of all the things you can do. That is to make sure that you can move around, as we've talked about, that you can, you are walking distances, and you have good neighborhoods, and you can move about and meet the other people. That is something which throughout history has been very useful and very much loved, and which we somehow forgot with the modernists and the motorists, but we are refinding it, and we have to use that in London, but also in the fast-growing cities desperately. We have to use this human approach to city planning more.
Okay, and we've got time for two more, and there were a couple over here. Yeah, there's one there, and one over there. Maybe I'll throw in a bonus one from over.
Thank you very much. Jon Kloss is the chief exec at UN Habitat, and he recently said in a presentation, we're very good at building buildings, but we're terrible at building cities. And I know, Jan Gehl, you've said before about the concept of bird shit architecture, the idea that buildings are dropped from drawing boards into situ without anyone actually going to see where they're going to go. And I wondered, if you look at architecture magazines or if you go to any architectural school, there's a great fetishization of the building, but not necessarily the space between buildings. And as an employer and as leaders, is there a problem with the very way that we're actually teaching people who are responsible for the urban form?
Oh my dear.
Hold that thought. And then the second one.
That's a half there.
The Thames Garden Bridge. Transport infrastructure, but not really. Meeting place, but not really. Public space, but not really. What is it for? Is it a piece of livable city that's been lost in translation?
Two very interesting questions. I'd like to.
That was a local question, I guess.
But we can translate it.
More local than you might think.
Yeah, I would like to take something on the first one. Having been in academia, having been a teacher, researcher for 40 years in School of Architecture, having traveled and been visiting professor here and there, many schools, and I have followed the education of architects and landscape architects and planners quite well, and it's very, very evident that the human dimension is not very much present in any of these professions' education. It hasn't changed much. As mentioned, I think that we threw out a lot of experience and knowledge about good human habitat with the modernists and with the invasion of the motor car, and we have not in the education really done much to pick up this lost knowledge and use it in our education. So I really think that the education in all these areas which have to do with planning cities and building buildings, they are very shallow in what they know about people. I have this story about how I get into all this, and that was something about me marrying a psychologist for 50 years ago, and at once started to have all these questions. Why do you architects not take a real interest in people? You are interested in all these other things, but people you know nothing about. I think there was a point there, and it still is a point. And I think that we have become quite good in cleaning up in the existing city districts after the motor car and making nice pedestrian streets and squares and parks, whatever. But we are still desperately not very good in making new stuff, whatever. And that's sort of not about, of course, the excellent stuff you do, but worldwide, I would say that the new stuff is really of a poor quality, seen from a Homo sapiens urban habitat point of view. The knowledge is simply not there, or it's not used there yet. I hope it will come. I have this joke, and that was, of course, a short time, I didn't have time to do it, that all my books have come out in China, but they've not had time to read them yet.
Richard, what do you make of the current state of architectural education?
I think we need to restructure deeply. I have said it, I'd like to spend the next little while rethinking. I think architecture has ended up, and the danger of it is that it's become about choosing lipstick on an elephant rather than actually changing the elephant. And I think to do that, we have to rethink what it's about. Obviously, the human element, but it's also why is architecture split up from urban design? Why is architecture split off from landscape? Why is it from urban sociology? It should all be together. I mean, obviously, engineering and so on. It needs to be much more. It needs to be more like medicine, in my opinion. It should be 3 or 4 years of general study, and then you specialize on these different situations. So that's my feeling. If we architects and the engineers are slightly better, to have any impression on the environment at the level of what you've been talking about, we have to define a new role.
We make a new school.
Absolutely.
Plenty of potential students here who will also excited. Watch out.
I wonder if I could just answer the bridge half.
Yeah, the garden bridge.
Okay. I mean, I've been more misled by journalists in the garden than I've ever on most things, but if I understand, sorry if I could dig that. If I understand, it is public. It's not going to be closed, maybe for hours. Yes, it doesn't allow bicycles because Transport for London doesn't like it, but so it's going to be a piece of land and gardens and so on over the Thames. Fine, great. And then what we're objecting to, as long as obviously enough money is raised, and I'm sure it'll be a good design. Why shouldn't they be there?
Let me pick that one up, given that Arup is
very
heavily involved in the garden bridge. I mean, I think all of the comments that you made are exactly why the garden bridge is a good thing. Because I don't think we should be designing pieces of infrastructure to serve single purposes. I think there's a historical tradition of not doing that, actually, in London even. You know, bridges didn't used to just be a place of getting A to B. People used to live on them, indeed. I'm not advocating that, but... Well, maybe, but I think the garden bridge serves multiple purposes. I think it does bring alive, actually, a slightly lost bit of territory on either side of the Thames where it meets the two banks, actually. I think it gives it a focal point. It gives that piece of London more of a focal point. It gives it frontage. It gives it a transformational kind of relationship, actually, with the river, which it doesn't exist at the moment. And it will take people from A to B, which is tremendous in that point where there is a natural desire to do so, and it just doesn't exist at the moment. I also think the first bicycle that goes across it, who's going to stop them?
I agree.
You know, where's the policeman going to be that's going to arrest someone for riding their bike across? So, you know, who knows how it's going to be used in the future, but that's part of the beauty of it. People will make
Isn't
of it
that also
what
part
they
of
want.
the danger when you say who knows what happens in the future, given that Transport for London is now been required to underwrite the entire maintenance costs in perpetuity?
No, I'm not questioning maintenance. I mean, there is a great tradition, frankly, of looking after our bridges in London. I think they're very well looked after, frankly, and I'm sure that Transport for London will do a good job of that. I think I'm more suggesting that it is an opportunity for Londoners to make of it what they like. It's a bit like a local, it's the way in which you address your local park. Different people think of it in many, many different ways, and I hope that that's what will happen with the bridge, and it will be a public asset, frankly, for people to enjoy in that way. I think my one comment on teaching, having come from a school of planning where we refused, the school refused to work with the architects in my particular university. I won't tell you which one it is. I certainly wouldn't advocate that, but I do wonder whether we look to the wrong schools for whether the training is right or not. We look to the architecture schools, we look to the planning schools, where I think the level of teaching, the quality of teaching is not bad. Whether we need to look to who trains the politicians and who trains the clients may be the bigger question, because I think the way in which planners, the way in which architects, the way in which landscape designers, so the design community currently is understood and engaged in projects is challenging, actually, and is becoming more and more challenging. And I don't know how you address that issue, but I'm not sure it's wholly solvable in the way in which we teach them.
By the way, I think the High Line was attacking exactly the same words when we were in New York. I remember I happened to be there. The way we'll never have a use. Yeah, I think we have to be optimistic, not to be too continuously nitpicking.
I think we have one final question from over this side of the room, and then we'll be continuing outside in the courtyard, so do stick around.
Thanks, yeah. Almost all of the ideas that you've discussed rely so heavily on engaging the citizen, and I think that we're actually getting a lot better at that. I think we've got ideas like Space Hive and Brickstarter, which are kind of engaging citizens on the funding side, but also sort of new materials and new ideas like WikiHouse, which are enabling self-build. And so I'd like to kind of get you to cast forward maybe 10, 20 years, and in a future world, if we've got the citizens almost doing the job of conceptualizing, designing and even building those spaces, what's the role of architects and town planners and local authorities in that future world?
A crowdsourced environment look like?
That was a good one to end.
Very good. Who would like to go first with that?
Yeah, I would take my chance here. Firstly, I do think that in all these discussions, like this one, it's very useful to start to think about what would it be 230, what would it be 250, what is going to change, and there are so many things which are interesting, and we have to realize already now that we are running out of fossil fuels, that we will have to move ourselves much more, that we will have a very much increasing elderly population, and we will have some places shrinking, some places growing very fast. And I've of course experienced many discussions where the horizon are 2 years from now. I think we need to have this longer perspective and be more visionary when we talk about even a future which is only 20 years from now. I think that in this discussion, then also, of course, one can start to discuss the role of the various players in the cities and in the building industry, and a number of things might change, and we could have hopes that they will change. That like the guys which Richard just mentioned with this new fantastic education, they will be able to approach the problems in another way. I think it's very important that we look into the future, and also we start to think about that. Just one thing is that we cannot have room in our cities to have mobility organized by everybody have 4 rubber wheels, 1 in each corner. And we don't have resources for that, and we don't have known propulsion for this. So we have to change just the way we think of mobility, and that will change city planning enormously, because we have built for 50 years on the basic principle of cheap gasoline, and that has given us the suburbs. And now we have a new situation, and maybe we have some knowledge about the climate change and some new challenges, so that we realize that we'll have to build in completely other ways, which I do think will look much more like the old cities than the suburbs we've seen from the past 50 years. And I think that people will actually rejoice about these new opportunities. And maybe we'll have also professions which can understand the things better. We can hope.
Richard, the future of the profession, given the kind of disaggregation of the conventional role of the architect?
I mean, I think it was a wonderful question, by the way. And it's wonderful, A, because it's about youth, and B, it's because it's about the future. So I think that's a terrific question. Until we get a much fairer society, a better distribution of wealth, a better distribution of education, it will be very unlikely we'll achieve that level in the next 50 years. We will need a totally different way of doing of business, we call it that way. If we get that, because and therefore the bottom line is not where we're always measuring it against, then we could achieve what you mentioned. At the moment, we certainly couldn't, because there's such a gap. I mean, one of the problems why it's not working, being on the negative side of it, is because there is no one to actually explain to those who are making those decisions, who are, let's say, doing something totally different, what their options are. We haven't got the structure. We need to put the structure. 50 years, allowing you to take a bet there won't be cars, so we'll be out of a job. And in other words, without the sort of car situation, those are interesting things. So there won't be cars, there will be something else. This energy question is a big question. Will we resolve that question? Are there other ways? But whether it's to do with individual control, I don't know. I would doubt it looking at the political situation.
I dread to think what the building would look like if I designed it. And so from that perspective, I'd be very content, frankly, for architects to continue actually to be the creative force behind the design of our places and our buildings. But I do think one really significant change that what you're describing could deliver, which is that in many respects, I think having the voice of a wider group of people involved in a debate around the design of buildings could well reinforce the role of the architect and reinforce the role of the planner, and actually give some strength perhaps to the arguments around improving design and improving design quality. Because I think more often than not, the people that are paying for those buildings make the decisions at the moment without necessarily that huge engagement with the occupiers or the owners that come later. So to a great extent, I think that's probably where the great opportunity does lie, and I would like to think that that reinforces the value of the professions, and perhaps actually does what we talked about before, perhaps reorientates our client groups, if you like, to engage with the professions in a different way.
Jan Gehl, Richard Rogers and Jerome Frost, and thank you.